Overcoming the challenges of how to use AI. Thank you for joining us today on the Cyber Executive Podcast. I am your host, Marc Ashworth, and today I have Ken McLoud of Laconic Tech with me to discuss this very topic. Ken, thank you very much for joining me here today.
Thanks for having me.
And before we get started, take 2 seconds, hit that follow button on your favorite podcasting app and share the Cyber Executive with your friends, your coworkers, and that one person who still thinks Monkey123 is cutting edge security password. All right. So Ken, thanks again for being here. And AI is the topic of everything, and we're all trying to figure out how to best use it in our enterprises and in our, whether it's small business, big business, it doesn't matter. So Ken, you're facing these challenges with your clients left and right. So how are you helping people make those decisions on what's the best way to use AI? It's not cheap. So how do you use it?
Yeah. So I think that like the biggest single thing here is to not be a solution in search of a problem. So we don't want to walk into the room and say like, where can we use AI here? Or we got to use more AI, right? This is how you wind up with projects that don't actually get used and don't show a good ROI. What you want to instead do is kind of put on the business consultant hat and think about what are our business goals? Hopefully we know really clearly what those are. And then once we know what they are, what are the biggest constraints, the biggest bottlenecks that are keeping us from achieving those goals right now? And then whatever the answer to that question is, the constraint keeping you from hitting your goal, that's the place to attack with these new AI technologies. So rather than going, where can I use AI? You first find the constraint of the business, and then there's a very high likelihood that we're going to be able to attack.
Yeah, great point. And those constraints could be anything from a large amount of data or inputting data, or, obviously AI works very well with doing a lot of things with data. And so, being able to take those big things and have it analyze that very quickly is a good area to, implement AI off of there. So from the different industries that you work with, is there a particular, what's some ideas there that we can kind of give our audience here on the areas of improvement that can be maybe a short turnaround of time, but also a big bang for the buck, a quick ROI to the organization?
Yeah. So there's three, I like to chunk these up into three categories of where we tend to see our biggest wins. And I'll kind of go from front of the house to the back of the house on these. The first one is AI powered lead magnets. So everyone's familiar with the idea of the lead magnet, right? This is the, enter your email address here to get a PDF with the 10 best tips for XYZ. And it's a way to lead with value and capture the fact that the person at this email address is interested in the topic that you're an expert on. Well, in the age of AI, we can personalize these lead magnets to the lead specifically. So we can take whatever you're expert in, and then maybe we can ask them a few questions or scan a file that we ask them to upload or scan their website. And then we can take and apply your expertise. And rather than a generic PDF on top 10 tips for XYZ, we can make top 10 recommendations for your specific situation. So now you've made a super valuable asset to this person who's interested in your business, established yourself as an authority, and captured their information as a lead. So that's lead magnets. The second one, and is kind of the bread and butter these days, is workflows, building agents to do workflows. So like obviously everyone's concerned and talking about AI taking people's jobs, but thinking about it in terms of replacing like seats in the org chart is usually not the way to go about it. One, because it's awfully bad vibes, but also because as we sit here in spring 2026, there are very few complete human jobs where AI can just wholesale replace the whole job. Maybe it's coming, but it's not here right now. However, if we start thinking of workflows, right, and each job contains within it several workflows. Maybe the workflows can span a couple of seats in that org chart. There are a lot of workflows that we can nearly completely automate with AI. Or maybe you still have a few human steps in there for review or for reaching out to talk to other humans. But so then by doing that, by isolating these workflows and then building out agents to do those workflows, we can now accomplish a lot more throughput with the same team that we currently have. So basically the net there is we're able to do a lot more revenue and therefore profit with the current team size. So that's the second one. That's agentic workflows. And then the third one is the data bit that you were just talking about. So me being an engineer and a data nerd, these are the ones that I get the most excited about. There's a lot of companies out there that are sitting on huge piles of data, databases that they've been accumulating for years or longer. But like they're not a big enough organization that it makes sense for them to have a data analyst or a data scientist on staff in order to reach into that database and pull out insights that are useful to the business. So they know they have this hugely valuable asset there, but they can't really take advantage of it. So what we do with these systems is we set up an agent and we give it a sandboxed environment where it can write and run code and query that data source. In most situations, we've got it walled off so that it can't write, edit, or delete that data source. It's a read-only connection. But now you can ask it arbitrary business questions, and it can write scripts to go pull data out of that database and then manipulate the data and make you graphs and charts and Excel files and whatever you need in order to get the business insight that you're after. So at the end of the day, you wind up with 80% of the value of having a $200,000 data analyst on staff for a tiny fraction of that price.
Yeah, the workflow component of that I think is very valuable, and I think there's a lot of workflows that are occurring that management don't really realize, and then also it's definitely not documented to be looking at or on how they're actually being done. And it's a good opportunity, I think, to one, make sure your workflows are documented, because then it allows for, if someone goes on vacation or someone gets replaced, you have that documented workflow. But then it also is a good time to look at it and say, okay, how can we improve off of this? And maybe it is automating part of the process, or maybe there's some risk that comes out of it too that was unknown, because maybe there's a chance of PII data or something else that might get leaked out, or the some sort of accidental type of problem with it. So it's a good time to evaluate the workflows, and something, if you're an operator, like a COO or something like that, or just a manager in general, document your workflows and then reevaluate them to see where there can be improvements off of it and drive those efficiencies. And then that allows for shifting of resources then, right? Because now you've taken care of one redundant workflow, and now you can shift that over and have them do something else at this point. So
no, completely. Like, I've got a few things to say about that as you were talking. One, I come from the manufacturing world, and I'm a big fan of I actually worked for Toyota for a while, the Toyota production system, or lean manufacturing, when people hear it called. And one of the big insights of that system is that the person out on the factory floor, the junior team member in that situation, often knows things about the process that the executive or the engineer don't know, right? Because they're actually there doing it every day and seeing the little idiosyncrasies of when things go wrong. So this applies when we're not talking about the factory floor and we're talking about automating office work too. The people currently doing those workflows need to be involved in this process and are probably going to have insights that leadership doesn't have. And then they're also going to be way more bought in. This is another insight from Toyota. They're going to be way more bought in on implementing that automation when they had a say in how it was built.
Mm-hmm.
But a great hack for this. So as you can imagine, like in a huge chunk of these processes we go to automate, one of the first things we ask is like, so do we have any documentation on this? Is there an SOP or a JM guide, anything like that on how this process goes? And often the answer is like, no. So a great trick we have here that we can use, even if you're not going to automate the process, is me or one of my team members will get on a call like this with the person who's doing the work and get a screen recording bot like Fathom or Otter or Fireflies in there. And we'll just go, okay, like pretend I'm your new intern. Teach me how to do this. Let's walk through the whole thing. And then we'll just kind of try to be curious and be asking questions about every little step of the way. Well, what if this didn't go like that? Or what if it was this option instead of that one? So that you're trying to gather as much of it as you can. Then you can take that Fathom call and pass it to a good AI and say, hey, make me an SOP document for this process that we're going over in this call. And it won't be perfect, but that probably gets you 80%, 90% of the way there and gets you through like a huge bulk of the drudgery of creating one of those. And the time that you spent is the hour on the Zoom call. It's a lot less time than it would have taken to make a good document anyways.
Yeah, so definitely.
A lot of times we'll do that, and that SOP becomes the basis for like a prompt or a skill file for the agent. But that SOP is also super helpful as a document for a human business.
Yeah, and the time that it takes to scribe it manually versus doing like what you're talking about and automating that process is, so much faster to be able to do that. And if you're going to be using AI anyway, let's drive those efficiencies, right? So let's allow for AI to help you with that. Okay, so in this process of discovery, and you're now, you've gone through, you looked at all the different processes, and then implementing, or deciding on which areas to implement. How do you help determine that? Or are you looking at, okay, well, here's this process, we got 15 people that does it, and we can consolidate this down to one agent? I guess what's some of the different factors that you look at that might help weigh which ones to implement on this type of process and to move this workflow over into AI?
Yep. Yeah. So we're like super focused on ROI here, right? Like I've got multiple testimonials from customers where we build a fairly expensive system for them. And then they come back and say that thing more than paid for itself in the first month of operation. That's the kind of stuff that we're after, right? Because I'm greedy. That's a great way to turn people into repeat customers and to get them to tell all their friends and colleagues about us. So the way that we find that stuff is to try to identify those bottlenecks in the business, right? So the first thing I'll generally ask is whether we're supply constrained or demand constrained right now. And the best rule of thumb, sometimes people just know, oh, I'm desperate for more business, I'm demand constrained. But if you're not quite sure, a good way to think about it is, how often are we telling our sales and marketing people to ease back off the throttle because we're worried we're not going to be able to deliver if they sell anymore? Right? And if the answer is never, like it's always full throttle on sales and marketing, then you're demand constrained. And the highest ROI effort is always going to be something around generating more demand, right? So then we'll ask, how are we getting new customers or clients now? And what's stopping us from doing twice as much of that, right? And whatever the answer to that question is probably something we can attack. Now, the flip side of this is if people are going like, ooh, all the time I'm telling the sales guys, ease off, I don't think I can deliver on that because we don't have enough capacity with people or in the shop or machines or whatever it is. So then we go and ask, okay, where is the step in the process that's actually holding us up there? Like, what's the thing? If the sales guys do make a huge sale tomorrow, what's the thing that breaks? And then the answer to that question is often something that we can attack with AI. And in either of those cases, if you can widen those bottlenecks even a little bit, that's where you get your home runs.
Great. So, what are some of the challenges do you find when implementing a AI solution? We've kind of talked about looking and discovering, but some of the challenges on implementing, or let's take it back before we even implementing. We've kind of hit on trying to find the areas of big buck, returns potential for there. So now, as far as going and trying to determine which model, let's start with that, which model to best utilize for that solution. What's the process that people should be thinking about?
You're good at asking questions that I'm like passionate about and want to hold on while I rant for 10 minutes about choosing models. So right now, one of the biggest things I think about this is that we need to avoid vendor lock-in. So all of the big shops would very much love you to get vendor locked in on OpenAI or Anthropic or Gemini. And then they've just got their hooks in you, and all your tokens in the future are going there. And like the fact that they want that is good for us because it's leading to very capable models and a bunch of very capable tooling around those models. But we want to try to fight this as much as we can so that we maintain our flexibility and can keep playing all of these providers off of each other. So to the greatest extent possible, we try to build these systems where the AI, the LLM, is an interchangeable Lego brick. It's just one piece, and a lot of times we use a tool called Open Router to be able to select between the various LLMs. And then we've got this whole harness and system built around it. And then you can swap out which brain you're using like it was a little Lego brick. So that's one thing is we try to avoid, we don't want to just build systems around Claude, even though Claude is awesome right now. Mm-hmm. Because in 6 months from right now, they might be behind. Right? There's a lot of people predicting that, as a matter of fact, because they're kind of behind on compute, and they've become so popular they're having to spend a lot of their compute on serving traffic. So we want to avoid getting locked in. And then for individual steps in a workflow, we're almost always testing the various models for that step. Right? So if you think of a workflow as 5 steps, maybe, it may very well be the case that GPT-5.5 does the best at step 1, and Grok 4.1 does the best at step 2, and Claude Sonnet 4.6 does the best at step 3. Mm-hmm. And like the only way you're ever going to find that out is to build your system so that it's an easily interchangeable Lego brick, set up your evaluations, your like test cases that you're going to try these out against, and try all the major models through there. So I don't want to make it sound like we're always doing that on every single AI call we make, because that would get tedious. But whenever we've got something that's like a real pain point on performance or on cost, a lot of times we'll trade a lot of these models off against each other.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a good point with the different models on different steps, because just playing with them, you can see that maybe ChatGPT does better off of this type of prompts, and Claude does better off of this type of prompts, and those sort of things. And so they do have, and if you're okay with that, then that's great. But if you do need to refine, you might have to do a best of breed, and those might change, and to have something like that router you were talking about in place to where you could shift those workflows over as one model improves off another one, or pricing changes too. That could be a driving factor too. So great. So now we've selected our model. What sort of challenges we should look out for in the implementation process of this?
Yeah. I mean, the biggest one that always comes up is the process mapping stuff we were talking about earlier, like with the SOP documents. Like 90% of the time, the biggest challenge is getting the knowledge out of the relevant people's heads. Because with real world businesses, there's always 100 of these edge cases. Like, oh, well, you email this person when that happens. Unless it's like this, then that. Or if it's like this and this, then you got to send 2 emails, one to this person, one to that person. And like the list of edge cases like that just keeps growing. And so like extracting that out is probably the single biggest, I don't want to call it a pain point because it's just kind of part of the job. That's what's got to get done in order to do this. But like that's where a lot of the work comes in. And the kind of system we've developed for doing this is we'll take a first pass at capturing the workflow, a lot of times through a Zoom call like we talked about earlier on. And then we'll just accept that, you're missing, you only captured 90% of it and you're missing a bunch of edge cases. And then we'll set the system up and go live with the full expectations that we're going to hit edge cases where this thing misbehaves. It was supposed to email Sally and Tim, but it only emailed Sally because we didn't know about that weird case where Tim also needs to get the email. And we'll just monitor. And when that comes up, we have the team flag it to us, and then we adjust the system so that it does that. And then you wind up with this, like, so the first week it's live, you've got a dozen of those. The second week it's live, you've got 3 or 4. And then it kind of tapers off as you go until eventually you're barely doing any babysitting at all and it's just running.
Yeah, and sometimes those edge cases, it's then digging into that edge case's workflow to find out, well, what's happening there. Well, all they're doing is A, B, and C steps. Well, okay, well, let's automate that. So now you're bringing those edge cases down to where those are being automated, and to where the notifications and stuff is not necessary because it's being placed into the system or a system B, maybe in order to accommodate the workflow for system A. So those edge case related documentation is just as critical as the main part. And now you're 95%, complete and on the goal for 100% at that point.
No, I can tell you've done this sort of thing before, right? A lot of times it's, well, why do we got to email him? Oh, so he can go put it in this Google Drive file. Why don't we just drop it in the Google Drive file?
Yeah. Yeah. Or why are you doing that in the first place? Why is that even happening? I remember years ago when I was coding, I was on an old matrix system for manufacturing inventory, and we were printing out a report that was 500 pages every day. And finally, we're trying to reduce printing and all the paper and all the stuff. And we go to the person, it's like, okay, what all do you get out of this report? And he goes, oh, I get the very last page off of this. I was like, what? And it's like, well, we could print you the last page. Well, but if something's wrong with it, I got to go through the detail. Well, that detail is online, so you can go into the system to get the detail. But then, and so once we did that, I mean, that guy, and that was just one of his reports that was like that. That same sort of concept of just asking the questions, well, what are you doing with it and why? And then a lot of times you'll find out that it's very minimal and you can just automate or simplify that process even for them. So, because all he was getting was one number off the summary page on top of that, So anyway, you never know what you're going to find once you start asking those questions and digging into them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So as we've implemented our AI technology and so how do you, or what recommendations do you have whenever it comes to, evaluating the ROI off of that, and then also the upkeep that's associated with the workflows to make sure that they're, working and, maybe monitoring the progress of it?
Yep. So the ROI stuff is usually fairly straightforward, right? So either we're driving more revenue or we're decreasing costs at the end of the day. And like, if the business is reasonably well organized, you'll be able to see either of those. There's usually a few sources of cost for the system, right? So everyone knows about the AI tokens that we're paying for. That's going to be a recurring cost. A lot of times with these systems, you have other APIs that you're hitting, and those APIs can have costs of their own. Though if it's a good business use case, those sorts of things wind up being trivial. It's an extra $10 a month or $50 a month. And if you've got a good B2B use case, it ends up being a rounding error. And then in terms of like maintaining them going forward, the first one is we always want to have good logging and monitoring set up, right? So that uh, we get monitoring alerts if something starts going horribly wrong. And then we've got logs so that if something does go wrong, we can go back and look at what the agent did and try to steer it in the right way in the future, or maybe put up some new guardrails to keep it from going down that path in the future. And then the obvious one that I'm sure everyone's already thinking of is keep it on top of new models as they come out. So like a lot of times there will be some use case where like it's just barely not working. It's like the model's just not quite smart enough to do what we want it to do here. And like the solution is wait 3 months because they're getting better so fast that like often I find when we're building, if the model's like just barely able to not do a good job, that probably means we're right in the sweet spot. Like just as we're rolling it out, we're going to get an upgrading capability and this is going to work great.
Wonderful. So, what are some additional challenges on to overcome whenever you're using AI and trying to implement that?
Yeah. So one that's interesting is and I think you mentioned it too. I've been building software since the olden days before we were using LLMs here. So we're used to thinking of compute, at least at normal scales, as essentially being free, right? Like we have these super powerful processors with all this RAM sitting on our desk, and to a business it doesn't cost very much. And like it's essentially the same cost if we're just trickling a little bit of math through there, or if we've absolutely got the thing humming with enormous matrix calculations. It's the same cost either way. But with AI systems, this is not really true. So like you definitely can, if you're pushing large volumes of data and you're pushing all the data through an LLM, you can quickly get up to serious costs where you've got to be worried about that. So it's kind of flipped on its head where before we're never really having to worry about the cost of compute at normal scales. And now with certain types of workflows, you absolutely have to worry about it. So then this comes into things like, first off, how much of that can we move into old school code? Because if it's doing some filtering function, let's say, that you could easily write a Python expression for, then you might as well do that in Python and it's going to effectively be free rather than paying for all those tokens. Like that's the first pass. And then if it's still something where there's like some judgment involved and it's not going to be straightforward to just write a Python expression to do this, then a lot of times we'll wind up doing that splitting between different models. So a pattern that we'll do a lot is if we're doing something that's a real fire hose of data, maybe we're reading every email from a large organization, trying to find particular emails. Well, if you're reading every single email with Claude Opus, it's going to get expensive. So what you can do instead is use one of the small models, like you've got GPT Mini and Nano, you've got Gemini Lite, you've got Haiku from Anthropic, and you can use one of those kind of small, fast, cheap, not so smart models as a filter. So you can say, hey, we're looking for emails that have this kind of shape to them. If you find one, flag it as yes. And then when it flags one as yes, then we pass it off to the big brain smart model in order to actually do whatever the workflow is. So that way we're not flowing the whole fire hose of data through the big, expensive, cutting edge model.
Great. So you're basically building layers into it and you're layering in different models within the solution off of there. Not necessarily at the work step level, but just in general, just on the evaluation of it. So nice. All right. Well, something I do with all of my guests and stuff is I ask them kind of the same questions throughout and just kind of get their take off of there. And so one of the things that I ask is, what in the industry should we stop doing? So what is something that we're doing that we shouldn't be doing?
I mean, I mentioned it early on, but it's walking into a room and saying like, we need to be doing more AI. like, I think it's true. There's a lot of opportunity in AI. Obviously, it's my whole business. But like thinking of it that way as being a solution in search of a problem is a recipe for failure.
And what's something in the industry that we could be doing better?
I definitely don't like how, in the course of a year here, it seems like 80% of the internet has become AI slop. And using the word slop intentionally, right? So the full of M dashes and rocket emojis and just the most like bland, trite corporate robot speak. And you see the set of incentives that got people there. You know, all the algorithms reward frequent engagement and frequent posting. And this is a way to do that without requiring any human involvement. So, like, I
Mm-hmm.
understand how we got here, but like LinkedIn in particular, I just can't stand the news feed or the comment section anywhere on LinkedIn. I was never a huge fan of it, but it's a completely useless platform now from that standpoint.
Yeah, and it's being used so often. And it's like, what's real, what's not now. And there was I was on Facebook yesterday, and there was someone posted some thing about like ranking cities in the state or something by the population, and all the populations were wrong. You know, and I made the comments like, "Well, looks like your AI model was wrong on this one." So so, people are using it, but then, it's going back to the old thing of, not validating or anything else. They're just taking it, and which is easy to do. You start getting faith in it, and then you use it for one way, and then it ends up it wasn't doing it right. And, but you got comfortable in using it before. So what's something you're tired of hearing about? And obviously, I didn't give him these questions ahead of time,
Yeah.
folks. So you can, so
I
which I
actually
try
asked
not
for
to
him and he
do on these
refused to hand
questions
them
for
over.
everybody. So,
No, uh, no, so it's this, and granted, so there are cases where this is completely valid, like you were talking about PII at the beginning, or there's obviously all sorts of sensitive government information or um, military stuff. But I hear a surprising number of like relatively small, let's say a manufacturing business saying like, well, we can't put these spreadsheets in there, then we'll just be giving OpenAI all this data. And it feels to me like when would this have been? Like the early 2000s, when people would be like, you can't buy that off the internet. You're just going to punch your credit card number into the internet. It's this like, there is a huge benefit to be gained for a tiny risk that there was some valuable insight to OpenAI in that spreadsheet that, by the way, they're promising they're not going to train on anyways if you believe them.
hmm
So like the people have a very like out of balance risk benefit assessment of these things sometimes. Now the real risk to be worried about is the thing like you're talking about. If you give the agent the ability to modify that spreadsheet and it goes and deletes a bunch of valuable data, that's definitely a legitimate thing to be concerned about, and you need to design around it. But just the fact that we can't use AI for this because then Anthropic, OpenAI, whoever is going to have our data, like if they wanted it, they've probably already got it anyways, unless you're doing something very sensitive.
Yeah. And I'll say that there's caveats to that, right? If you're developing something that's using an API, you're doing it in a more of a closed model. But if you're just going to chatgpt.com and dumping a spreadsheet with customer data in there with their names and addresses and socials and all that, don't do that. Okay.
No, they're
That's
open
not
on
a
that.
good thing.
If you're
Yeah.
on a free account, they are training on that data.
Right.
That's
Right.
how So
Yeah.
so the next iteration of the model will know the things that were put in to
Yep.
free accounts. Yeah. So
Yeah.
all of the stuff that we're talking about is business use cases where you're on
Yeah.
paid accounts using the API.
Yeah. So
Absolutely.
one other question for you, Ken. What is something that you're following? What's a trend that you're watching right now to see where it's going?
I think probably the biggest thing, this is going to get a little nerdy, but the biggest thing that I'm interested in is this idea of an agentic harness. So this is the software that we wrap around an LLM in order to have it do useful business work for us. And like probably the best all around one, in my opinion, right now is the Anthropic Agent SDK, which is kind of the heart that's underneath Claude Code and Claude Cowork and a few more of their tools. It is possible to run that with other models, though it's not officially supported by Anthropic for obvious reasons. The other one that's made a lot of big news in the last 3-4 months here is OpenClaw, which is an entirely open
Mhm.
source one that's kind of meant to run full time rather than just when invoked. That's like a 24/7 kind of a system rather than a waiting for you to invoke it system. And like the absolutely these sorts of systems, and we've got some that we've built ourselves too, and we use those, uh, are the way that we're going to be doing economically valuable work with these things in the future. So, kind of who wins these wars and how this landscape winds up shaping up is very important. Like, are these going to be the kind of old school Microsoft systems where it's a very locked down, closed ecosystem, or is a more open source and open and interchangeable model going to win out? I'm obviously voting for the last one.
Yeah, I would definitely want open source if we can, right? So it just makes it better to vet and everything else too. So
Yeah, and it'd be
well,
way more easier to support the interchangeable Lego brick model of LLMs like we are always pushing for.
yeah. Well, Ken, thank you very much for being part of the Cyber Executive podcast today. I appreciate all your insights and having you on here. So thank you again.
Thank you.
And for everyone else, again, hit that follow button on your favorite podcasting app and share the Cyber Executive with your friends and coworkers. Until next time, thank you very much.